Good evening, and a very warm welcome to all of you to what promises to be a very, very interesting and engaging interaction this evening. I am very privileged that two brilliant officers of the Indian Foreign Service, and I should say I had the privilege of having both of them as my colleagues. Ruchira was on her first proper posting in Mauritius when I was High Commissioner, so we had time to spend together. And later on, when I was Foreign Secretary, then Akbar came and took over as the Director of the Foreign Secretary's office. And I can say that without his support, it would have been very difficult to function as Foreign Secretary here in India. I think you have been given the bio of each one of the officers, but I don't think they really need much of an introduction. Let me start with Akbar. He has had a very distinguished career in the Foreign Service, but after having served in the Foreign Secretary's office, he also became Joint Secretary in charge of administration. But later on went on and had a very distinguished career at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, where he was working in the office of the then Director General El Baradei, and who has a very, very high opinion of him and really appreciated his services. But later on, Akbar came back here, and I think for many of the journalists who are present here, he was probably one of the best Joint Secretary external publicity that we have had in recent years. High profile, but very understated, and very popular amongst the press in India. And then, of course, his last posting was that as our permanent representative to the UN in New York. And again, a career that I mean, it was the top of his career, where he retired from New York. But again, I think many of you are aware of an excellent performance at New York as our permanent representative. And we are very fortunate that when he came back, he has gone to Hyderabad, and he is now heading a School of Public Policy in Hyderabad. And we are very, very happy to welcome him to the India International Center. Ruchira has also had a very distinguished career. Of course, after serving in Mauritius, she had much better things to do. But importantly, she was our Chief of Protocol, and I think you must have seen her a lot during the high-level visits to India. And she has served in our missions in South Africa, and also, I think, twice in New York. Yeah. She was in our permanent mission, serving as consular, yeah. And then later on went back as our permanent representative, and she has only recently retired and come back. Again, a very distinguished career at the United Nations. So we are very privileged to have both of them come to India International Center, and what they will be talking about is really the future of multilateralism in an age of resurgent nationalism. My own view is that there is no option but to, in fact, act multilaterally, for the simple reason that most of the challenges which we face today, whether it is climate change, or whether it is pandemics that we went through, or what we are facing today, like cybersecurity, now artificial intelligence, virtually all these different challenges which we face are all cross-national in character. they are also global in dimension. And the only way that you can have any kind of international governance in these areas is through multilateral approaches. So there is no alternative to multilateralism. The UN supposedly has failed. Most people, say that the UN has become almost irrelevant. But I think we forget that the United Nations is actually a creature of all its members. So if we are talking about the UN not being effective, we are really saying that its members don't want it to be very effective. So the UN has not performed according to what our expectations is, but I don't think that we can just lay the blame on the United Nations as an organization. Both have been our PR to New York, so they are very, I think, familiar with the workings of the United Nations. And actually, there are some things that work. And yes, there are other things that don't work. But I think, as I said, multilateralism is something which is indispensable in today's world. And therefore, to answer this question, whether UN or some form of international governance is possible, particularly when it is really the crying need of today. And are there ways in which we can, not just the UN, but other institutions, can they be made perhaps relevant to resolving the challenges which we face? So without further ado, I will now hand over the chairmanship to my friend Akbar, who will not only chair this session, but before we have Ruchira give her address on this subject, Akbar will also share some of his own perspectives on this important subject. We will then have, after Ruchira has spoken, we will then allow them to have a brief conversation with each other. And then we will have maybe 15 minutes or so of questions and answers. So that's going to be the evening. Please enjoy the evening. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Saran. Like all of you, I've actually come to listen to Ambassador Kamboj. I've been, for about now almost 4 years, a recluse in Hyderabad. This is one of my first forays outside Hyderabad. And I'd like to thank Ambassador Saran for providing me that opportunity to engage with many old friends. I also see that some of my students have come here. So you can see the expanse of the engagement, some very good colleagues from the Foreign Service, some journalists, and some young students who I surprisingly find here. So thank you, sir, for that opportunity. And I look forward actually to listening to Ambassador Kamboj. But as a precursor to her talk, let me try and put it in perspective of why did we come here? Because if we have to try and see, are we going to look at solutions in the future? It's useful to understand also why did we get to where we are. So I was just thinking in my career, what would have been the most interesting statement that I was present at when this language was being reflected. And I thought maybe I should start with that statement because the leader who said it very eloquently, is an important leader, and you'll see why I'm starting with that.
The free world must embrace its national foundations. It must not attempt to erase them or replace them. looking around and all over this large, magnificent planet, the truth is plain to see. If you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation. Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special and unique.
I don't have to say much more. I will not get into a debate with that because what the future holds also is in his hands. So I just thought, let's not forget what was the past and what is staring you in the future. So it's good to have an understanding of the atmosphere that we are working in. Having said that, I just thought, well, presidents and leaders say statements, and this is a General Assembly statement in 2019. But I said, what's the popular culture? So these days, I am a tired and a retired diplomat. So I thought I dabble a little in AI, ChatGPT. So I decided that I will talk to ChatGPT and ask, what does it think about the reality of multilateralism or global organization vis-a-vis the vision. So I dabbled with ChatGPT, and nowadays if you just talk to ChatGPT, it can even pictorially depict what is the reality. So I said, let me look at what popular algorithms are saying. And look what I got.
The free world must embrace.
Right. No. Sorry. Look, the algorithm is saying that this is the reality on the left, or this is the vision on the left, the reality is on the right. So you can see that it's not a thinking that is only in the minds of some leaders, it's got into popular culture. And we need to understand that there is something going on beyond what we are thinking. Now, whether it's correct or wrong, I will not get into it. Ruchira's problem is to answer those things. But I will try and indicate that why did we get it here? That popular culture, this is DALI, if any of you are interested in checking it out. You go to ChatGPT, ask it, and it uses DALI to project what it sees is popular culture. Maybe correct, maybe wrong, I'm not getting into that. But that's what the popular culture seems to say. Now, if that is so, why did we get here? And it's important to look at that. So I just looked, it's good to look at facts and figures rather than talk. So I looked at the facts and figures of, I just took the UN, but it is, frankly, for all international organizations, is broadly the same. So if you look at it, one country in 25 years has increased its contribution by 15 times. One country. 2000, it's about 1 point some percent. Today, it's about 16%. Now, if you have one country doing that, what happens? Naturally, the country starts saying, I need more space. I'm now contributing more. And look at the 3 countries above the US. The US is blue, and there are 3 other countries. That's Russia, France, and UK. You add up all the 3. The one country on the top, the red, is contributing more than 3 other of its peers. I don't have to say very much more. Because if you ask Chinese diplomats, they say, sometimes in quiet whispers, but sometimes much more directly, he who pays the piper calls the tune. 16% in the last 20 years, obviously we need a greater share. But as we all know, it's not so easy to change that. So what are the others doing? We need to have a look at that. If one country is increasing its contributions, and these are assessed contributions, which means these are assessed according to their economic structure, GDP, etc. And this is approved by the UN. So these are figures, easy to pick them up. There is a coordination of the CEB, which is the Chief Executive's Board for Coordination, available on the website. It's not done so graphically. I just took the data. Some of my young students helped me to put it together to show you what the reality is. So let's look at the obverse side. This is SS contributions. Now, in the international system, there was no concept of voluntary contributions in any of the original documents of the UN, any document, whether it's the statute of some international organization, the UN Charter. This does not exist. Yet, till 1990s, it was very insignificant. In the burst of multilateralism becoming more effective after 1991, it started changing. For the first time, it happened that it became significant when I was the first secretary. Ambassador Suri is here. He used to be my DPR. And with his knowledge of China, he made me see what was happening. And voluntary contributions were going up. Let's look at where voluntary contributions are now. Look at this. These are the sources of revenue of international organizations. So the bottom one, 18% is all that SS contributions are addressing. Look at what is happening. 67% are voluntary contributions which are earmarked, which means I can give you the amount and you will do as per what I have requested you. So 67% of all international organizations, and this is all, not one UN organization, all UN organizations, all multilateral by and large, are reflecting 67 plus 8 are untied. So actually 75% is through donors. Now, if you look at it very carefully, it's all increasing in the 21st century. As one country is increasing its SS contribution, other countries are increasing their voluntary contributions to balance this out, because SS, you don't have a choice. Voluntary, you have a choice. So what's happening? Issues which were of importance before in the UN system are now being addressed in different manners. So development, once upon a time, was a major issue. Today, it's humanitarian assistance, because the money that is coming into the UN from voluntary contributions is primarily going into that area. So there is a tug of war, which I just wanted to show you through these statistics, that there's a tug of war going behind the scenes in a subterranean manner, which is being reflected in many other things, and we can see those things, and I'm certain Ruchira will explain those things. So just let's look at what is changing. Peacekeeping used to be one of the UN's most frequently used tools. I just looked at the statistics. 2010, 100,000. Today, 63,000 or something, the latest according to June statistics. This was a tool which was the preferred tool, but it was not getting traction, so people started not putting in there. The last big peacekeeping operation that the UN undertook was in the Central African Republic, 2014. There is no other big peacekeeping operation which has been started since then. There are small ones, Colombia, other places. 200 observers, 150 military observers, etc., there is no big peacekeeping operation likely. So UN as a peacekeeper is going down. Now, of course, you can say still 60,000 is not small, sure. And it's important too. So I don't want to any of you to think that the UN is a god that failed. It's a tool of diplomacy like other tools are. Multilateralism is a tool of diplomacy, and where it is helpful, people use it. Where it is not very helpful, people try and find other ways. Let's look at something else. SDGs. Now, this was a development goal, sustainability and development. Look at what it is. 16% are on track or are to be achieved. 20% are worsening. The rest have limited progress. So you can see by 2030, SDGs are not going to be fulfilled. We can say what we want, but at 16%, we are not going to achieve at 2030. So if you just look at some of them are red, that means those are not at all likely to be achieved. The other ones are orange, which are, and there are some green where there is progress. So you can see the global trend in peacekeeping, in development. This is not where the money is going. This is not where things are going to move. So what are the challenges that are now facing the UN? So I've just listed 5. There can be more, I'm certain. So these I call the challenges of modernity. We've seen peacekeeping is coming down, and you all know what is happening in terms of security. While on the one hand, there is securitization of everything. Security is not only the traditional peace and security, but health, climate, energy. You can name these issues, and it's not likely that the apparatus that is there is going to address them, even though the expanse has increased. Sustainable development, we just saw. I just wanted to mention ungoverned spaces. And it's an important thing because it's not only state actors, but there are non-state actors in this. And by ungoverned spaces, what I meant was outer space. There's a treaty from the 1960s, which is now almost coming apart. Which is the institution which is now regularly pushing that? No country. It is Elon Musk. We are going to have the sovereign republic of Elon Musk soon because he is sending more space satellites into space than any country or all countries to put together also this year. So you can see that there are new actors where nobody is willing to look at how do we address these issues. Similarly with new technologies, AI, ChatGPT. ChatGPT, you can see, is not on the UN side. It's on the other side pretty clearly. For what reasons, I don't know who's doing the algorithm, but clearly. So you have a challenge there. There are existential crises, which Ambassador Saran mentioned, pandemics, climate change. Now, it's not that there is a total one-sided view. There are, in some areas, they have done well. For example, climate change. The US said, I don't want to be there. The US said, I come back again. And there are other countries who stood in peace and security because the UN Security Council has a special role, and in no other system is that special role that it acts on behalf of everybody. But in most other things, if some country is there or not, Ruchira was in UNESCO. The US has come in and gone out of UNESCO several times. But it is the so-called Lilliputs who have held it together. So if you look at multilateralism as Gulliver and the Lilliputs, there are the big countries, and there are Lilliputs trying to ensure that they fall into place by tying them up in various ways. I mean, it's a way of looking at international organizations. The Lilliputs have a challenge, but so Gulliver is not indispensable. Yet in peace and security, that's a different story because that is the only organization that can act on behalf of everybody, whereas in other places you can't. Similarly, one last thing that I would want to say is change management. You know, we all use these equipment. So you want to update it, we go there. press 0.2.1 version comes in. It takes us 5 minutes, less than that, to update it. Unfortunately, international organizations or multilateral system doesn't have a change management system. And that's the biggest challenge, that if there was a change management system, it could have worked very quickly. We could do the changes. And we will get into it. She will talk about how is change happening and what are the elements of change. Right. So this is supposed to be the instrument through which change is coming. And Ruchira will talk, and I will not talk very much about it, because she knows better how is change going to come, what are the prospects of change, what is happening, and what may not happen. And the trajectory is best told by somebody who is up to date, rather than people like me who are in Hyderabad, far away from the action. I don't think I can say anything. That brings me to the last point. So what does the future hold? Now, there are many models. There is a model of business as usual, which we clearly see that is not working. There is another model of fighting and cooperating. That's the new normal. You have to learn that in some areas, perhaps it will not work well. In some other areas, it will work well. There is a third model which says everything is going to be punctured. I don't know, Ruchira will decide which of those three, and you will respond to her. And there is a small little thing, if you see up, multilateralism, it is said, is a engagement of 3+ countries based on some common principles and common general principles. We have new formats which we call minilaterals, plurilaterals, others. So if you see, there are fists and small fingers also there. So you will work through small fingers and fists will be there. So I don't know whether that's the new form, and that's for Ruchira to tell. So I will stop here. I've given you an introduction to what things are, how they have progressed here, and she will take over and tell you the nitty-gritty of what is happening right now. So thank you very much for being very patient now.
Thank you very much, Akbar. Pleasure to see you again, and pleasure to reconnect with you, and deeply honored to share the stage with you. And sir, thank you so much for your warm and generous words. I don't think I can forget my early days in the Foreign Service when you were my High Commissioner. And very honestly, I learned so much from just silently observing you. So thank you very much for bringing us together, for giving me this platform, and of course to engage with this wonderful audience. And I can see so many of my seniors are here. I am deeply touched and very, very honored. So to turn to the topic at hand, the future of multilateralism in an age of resurgent nationalism. Well, I would say the title is somewhat portentous, seeming to imply that multilateralism hangs in the balance, multilateralism is under threat, and that this is working at variance with nationalism. Now, nationalism, as we know, looks inwards, is more protectionist, and doesn't necessarily work for the common good. And we just saw that wonderful excerpt that you showed. Whereas multilateralism, as we know, thrives on collaboration, cooperation, dialogue, diplomacy, negotiation, dialogue, and all of that. But my question to you is, does this have to be a binary? Cannot the two coexist? And haven't there been instances in the past, many instances I would say, where nations have pursued the national self-interest and have also worked for the common good? Now, I remember the words of a very famous Secretary General who has said that multilateralism is not just a way of working, it's a way of thinking. It is a way of recognizing that we are all in this together. But here's the question. Are we in it together? Now, certainly, if you look at the record of the United Nations in the last 5 years, I think the report card is not very good. Let's start with the COVID pandemic. the mother of all crises that we all confronted just about 4 years ago, instead of nations cooperating, collaborating, reaching out to each other, what did we see? The most extreme cases of nationalism, the most extreme cases of vaccine nationalism. And I cannot think of many countries, apart from the government of India, of course, that extended a helping hand to others in the course of this crisis. Where was the United Nations? Where was the World Health Organization? In fact, one of the permanent members of the Security Council refused to accept a delegation of WHO experts by simply refusing to grant them visas. My next example, one that I lived through in the United Nations, Ukraine. We all know what happened in Ukraine. The United Nations Security Council was and continues to be till date completely polarized, completely divided, unable to pass even a single resolution on peace and security, on a ceasefire. And that is the situation till date. In fact, let me give you a little example, a little segue. We were in the council. This was August 2022. Those were the heady days of the BSGI, the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And there was a bit of a euphoria in the United Nations amidst a pall of gloom that, yes, the Secretary General and the United Nations had brokered something that was humanitarian, that would be a sort of a palliative. And there were the E10 members, the non-permanent members, including us, and some of us felt, and Mexico took the lead, and felt that let's bring out a short statement commending, lauding the United Nations, specifically the Secretary General, for brokering the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And what do you think happened? Nothing. There were no ambitions to craft a presidential statement, certainly not. No ambitions to have even a statement, no ambitions for a press release, certainly not a resolution, simple 2 lines, and we were working on them. The Security Council commends the Secretary General for concluding the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which would meet the humanitarian needs of the people of the world. Even that was not possible. That is the level of polarization that you see in the Security Council. And the mother of all ironies, one of the permanent members happens to be the president of the Security Council in the very midst of the Ukraine crisis. So what can you expect? So we have lived through all of that. And of course, what can I say about Gaza? I think this horror has unfolded before all of our eyes. And the Security Council has been completely exposed. If there was any doubt that was remaining, completely unable to craft any resolution to bring about the simplest of things that was staring at you in the face, an immediate and unconditional ceasefire to stop the horrors that were happening on the ground. And many of those humanitarian workers, I spoke to many of them, they said, we've seen all kinds of crises across the globe, but what you're seeing in Gaza is a simple carnage. It is hard to even bear and see this. But did the council do anything? Nothing at all. One or other of the permanent members were casting a veto on any resolution. So the UN was rendered completely useless, to be particularly blunt about this. And there were 2 resolutions that were eventually passed, one at the behest of a non-permanent member, Malta, and there was another resolutions, if I remember them correctly, 2712 and 2720. But they were entirely humanitarian focused on the condition of women and children. Why? Because the core issues, you could not have the council agreeing on any of the core issues, the ceasefire and the release of the hostages. And by the way, the 2 council resolutions that were passed were not enforced, were not implemented on the ground. So what does this say about the Security Council? What does it say about the United Nations? And what does it say about multilateralism? Is it keeping peace and security? And quite clearly, the answer is no. And it is not because the council is not meeting or not working. Actually, when we were in the council, as we were exiting, we did a study. The meetings of the Security Council have increased in recent years. But what is the output? It is the output that matters, and that is where the council is lacking. And I will also add here very quickly that this polarization and division that you're seeing in the Security Council, which has rendered it completely ineffective without an iota of doubt, has also spilled over to the General Assembly. And all of its committees are also under the shadow of this very polarization. So quite simply put, the United Nations today, the track record is, one could say quite clearly that the United Nations is failing in its core mandate. And as Akbar has mentioned, yes, there have been areas where it's delivering also, and we all know those. But what about the core mandate? As we often say, you might go hoarse saying that the General Assembly is doing this and the General Assembly is doing that, but for the public, for the people, the United Nations is the Security Council. And if it fails to deliver on its core mandate, well, then certainly I think questions are very legitimate. By the way, both for Ukraine and Gaza, there were innumerable sessions, emergency sessions of the General Assembly, simply because the Security Council was unable to pass anything. And while the General Assembly, both in the case of Ukraine and Gaza, passed resolutions, had very intense debates, but at the end of the day, as all of you know, the General Assembly only has moral weight. There is no legal or binding nature to what it says or does. So that is where we stand. So now, if I were to highlight some of the other failures of multilateralism, I would say yes, exactly as Sir mentioned. It hasn't delivered on climate change also. What about cybersecurity, nuclear disarmament? Earlier on, the crisis in Syria. Today, as we are told very often, there are more than 100 conflicts across the globe. And yes, Akbar is absolutely right. The nature of peacekeeping is changing too. And the United Nations, in fact, is pulling out, drawing down, because it is just not working. There is not enough money. The mandates are not there. And there is a big push from the Africans that they would like to deal with their own problems in their own way. So that is the overall picture emerging that we see of a United Nations that seems to be failing in its core mandate. Now, let me just look at it this the other way, the flip side. So, is the story over? Should we write off the United Nations? Is this obituary time? And here I would like to bring in some perspectives which I think are very important and bear a mention. First and foremost, the United Nations, 193 countries, is made up of a very core constituency of small states. Now, the small states are numbered at around 108, and the small island developing states are about 38 out of those 108 states. So that's a very large constituency. So these small states, for them, the United Nations has a lot of relevance and a lot of meaning. It is a chance for them to amplify their voice, to punch above their weight, to highlight their priorities and concerns, and also to protect their interests. And let me give you two very quick examples that I noticed. When I was in the Commonwealth, the grouping of 54 countries, as you all know, the one program that was really the most popular in the Commonwealth was the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation. It wasn't the summit meeting. It wasn't even the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, which actually suspends members, those who do not subscribe to the core values of the Commonwealth. But it was the Technical Assistance Program. And why? Because the bulk of the Commonwealth were the small states. For them, it really mattered. Just a training program here, or an infrastructure program there, or a project somewhere else really mattered to them. In fact, I would venture so far as to state that the smaller the state, the more relevant multilateralism is for them. So therefore, I think that if anything, the small states find this as a very unique platform to air their concerns and protect their interests. And another very important issue that is of relevance in the United Nations, lest any of you think that most of the discussions are pretty useless, actually that's not the case, is the whole issue of sea level rise. Now, climate change has brought this issue very much to the fore. And for small states, this is really, most of the small states, this is a very, very existential issue. For example, what happens when a nation goes under? What happens to the identity of that state? What happens to its sovereignty? What happens to its maritime boundaries? What happens to its cultural identity? What happens to the human rights of those who are displaced? These very issues are being discussed very intensely in the 6th Committee of the United Nations, led by the small states. It's a chance for them to use this platform to amplify their concerns. And on the 25th of September, in the margins of the UN Summit of the Future that Akbar alluded to, there will be a special high-level meeting on sea level rise. So therefore, I would say that for some of these states, most of them, and I've talked to a lot of them, there is a lot of cynicism in the United Nations these days about the future of the United Nations, the future of multilateralism, precisely what we are discussing today. But most of them feel, well, it's not perfect, by no way, but it is still very useful. It is a very relevant platform that brings countries together, and most of all provides a very vital space for countries to engage, dialogue, discuss, negotiate, and hopefully come to some conclusion sometimes. So I would say in multilateralism, whether it is any format of multilateralism, it protects small states who would otherwise be exposed to the depredations of an unequal world. My second point, and I think that is something that Sir mentioned, that ultimately, what is multilateralism? It is a member state-driven affair. So, the United Nations or any other multilateral organization is only as good as the cooperation that it gets from its member states. For example, why did the BSGI, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, ultimately collapse? Simply because it did not get the cooperation from the principal protagonists in the final analysis. And there have been many crisis centers across the globe. There have been many instances when the Secretaries General have boarded a flight into the theater of conflict to resolve that crisis. But at the end of the day, the Secretary General or the United Nations gets that authority, that capacity from the member states. If the member states are not willing to cooperate or to engage, what can the United Nations do? So I think we should also remember that the UN is not a cure-all, certainly not. Shombi may agree with me, but at the end of the day, it does provide a very vital platform and a very vital space for member states to engage, discuss, and collaborate. The other point that I do want to make, which is a failing of multilateralism, and which I think Akbar has referred to, is the bilateralization of the United Nations. And by that I mean that the financial contributions, he's absolutely right, the entire nature has flipped. Earlier, it used to be really the assessed dues or the annual dues and then the voluntary contributions. But today it is completely out of proportion. Most of the funding of the United Nations is from the voluntary contributions of member states, who are actually, therefore, certainly calling the tune. And those funds are entirely earmarked, and the assessed dues form a very small part of the funding of the United Nations. So this bilateralization of the United Nations has also given a very different character to multilateralism. Now, the question that I therefore want to ask is, what then? Is the UN too weak, too politicized, or too beholden to powerful donors to really demonstrate any independence of action? And I would say that it is a mixed bag. It is not a yes or a no. There are instances when the UN has completely failed. I don't think any of us would disagree on that. But there are many, many areas where the UN is still working, seeking to craft agreements. One of the recent successes through which we lived, which was the General Assembly procedure, was the BBNJ Treaty, that is Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, where after months and years of discussion, we could hammer out a treaty in terms of how you will conserve and preserve biodiversity resources, which is beyond the national jurisdiction of countries. So there are successes, there are smatterings of successes, so a bit too early to write off multilateralism. Now, in terms of writing off, I do want to mention that there is often a discussion in the United Nations, with which you're all very familiar. How long can the United Nations remain unreformed? And I think we all know the argument, so I will not waste time there. Certainly, I think we all agree in gist that the world of 1945 and the world of 2024 are very different, and therefore it is absolutely essential that the United Nations should change. And if you ask me the question, can this happen? I would say, yeah, for sure, because it is written in the provisions of the Charter that the United Nations should expand and reform. But the practical reality is that this is a very complex and a very sensitive process that hits at the most raw nerve of every member state in the United Nations based off their perceptions of power and influence. So there are, of course, the protagonists. No guesses for who are the protagonists. There are also the naysayers, not too many guesses there too. But what I will say that one permanent member is virtually a de facto member of the naysayers club. And then there is a silent majority. A silent majority which ironically should have been more active, but which really has taken a very I would say, a very extreme and unpragmatic view of how reform should happen, the all or nothing approach. And ironically, this majority would benefit the most, perhaps, if the Council was reformed and expanded, because most of the issues that the Council deals with belong to this particular constituency. Now, very often this question is raised when we talk about reform and expansion, that what will you achieve with this expansion? Already the Council is completely stymied with 5 permanent members and 5 vetoes. Why do you want to add to this mess by 5 more permanent members, potentially, and 5 more potential vetoes? Well, the answer to that, as I've often said, is not about numbers. The answer is about bringing a greater diversity and democracy of voices to the top table. There is certainly a case for countries from underrepresented and unrepresented regions to be on the top table. Countries like Brazil, Africa, and most certainly, of course, India. But the process is so gamed that it is not going to happen easily. And if I am asked the question as to whether this is a worthwhile effort or is this a wasted effort, should we even pursue this, should we look at other options? Well, certainly, I think there are many, many other organizations that are doing extremely valuable work. But at the end of the day, I would say that if a country such as India does not talk about the principle of it and does not flag the principle of it, well, then nobody will. The P5 are very comfortable, as we all know. The naysayers couldn't be happier or would be very happy to settle for a piecemeal reform, which we are not in favor with. And the silent majority, of course, has other pressing issues on the table. So very often this question is asked, and I do believe very strongly that yes, there is a lot of merit, there is a lot of use in continuing this debate, because the principle of it must be flagged, the unfairness and injustice of it, particularly the use of the veto, which has completely, without a doubt, stymied the working of the Security Council, and therefore has raised doubts about the utility of multilateralism. Well, what does the future hold then? Well, now this is where the summit of the future comes into play, and this is what was, I think that this is what you were alluding to. Well, this was born out of an idea. The whole idea was born in 2020. I think that was the year when you left the UN. The heads of state and government had mandated the Secretary General to look into this matter very seriously and come out with a blueprint for rebooting the United Nations. So on came the Secretary General, and in 2021, he brought out a document called Our Common Agenda. And through that, he has expanded and amplified upon his vision, which is to turbocharge, the UN is full of jargon, so don't smile, which is to turbocharge the United Nations, turbocharge multilateralism. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to build the United Nations of our dreams. I would say a noble vision, indeed a very good vision, a vision worthy to be put on the table, and a vision worthy to be discussed by its member states. And that is precisely what the member states are doing even as I speak. Drafts have been circulated, drafts have been rewritten, a document is in the process of being done. It is essentially going to look at 5 fundamental issues. One is, of course, the whole issue of development, which is fundamental to the global south. The second issue is, of course, peace and security, particularly issues of territorial integrity and sovereignty, and the whole issue of sanctions, which has become very important post-Ukraine and Gaza. The third chapter is science, technology, and innovation and digital technologies, to which will be annexed what is called a global digital compact. Very important again, because I think most countries are agreed that even as digital technologies, and we live in a tech-driven era, the gap is not narrowing, and therefore we should do our all to make these technologies available for all, which includes artificial intelligence as well. The fourth chapter, I think, is relatively uncontroversial, hopefully. One can never say. It's about youth, and there is a declaration for future generations to be appended to that. What sort of planet are we bequeathing to our future successors? And finally, guess what? The last chapter is on the most vexed issue, the issue of global governance. I'm not a prophet, certainly not a prophet of doom, but I will say that on this last chapter, the issue of global governance, the mood in the United Nations is more towards a reform of the IFIs and less towards a reform of the United Nations Security Council. So there you are. The Secretary General's vision, a very noble vision, I would say, of an ambitious document that would really reboot the United Nations, create a UN 2.0, obviously with the pulls and pushes, would come up with something which may not be optimal. The good news is that member states are agreed that there will be a document. So there will be an outcome document as always, but as to what it is, we'll just have to wait and see. But an opportunity and a chance to do something differently, particularly the issues that plague the vast majority of nations of the global south. Now, after dealing with the Summit of the Future, I think if I look at where we are today at the United Nations, I would say that I would arrive at two inescapable conclusions. First and foremost, I'm the first to say that multilateralism is not perfect. It is not perfect. It is imperfect, but it remains yet the best framework to deal with global challenges. I think that is the inescapable conclusion. It's too early to write the obituary of the United Nations. Surely, and yes, there are many organizations around this globe that have convening power, that can get countries to gather under one platform. There is the G20, there's the G7, there's the European Union, there's the Commonwealth of Nations, there's the ASEAN, etc., etc., etc. But I think what makes the United Nations unique is its universality, 193 members. I do not know of any other organization that has 193 member states. Its comprehensive mandate, from peace and security to human rights to sustainable development, and of course its legitimacy, because the UN has certain core values to which most member states seem to concur with. And of course, my second conclusion is that the future of multilateralism may look a little uncertain today, absolutely, but one thing is equally clear to me, which is that its success will depend upon our collective efforts. I think there is no escaping that. It is up to us how we meet the challenge, how we build the future, how we work towards a just and equitable world in the hope to leave nobody behind and in the hope to dignify all. So I will leave all of you with a question. What kind of a world do we want to leave behind? One that is fragmented and failing, or one that is united and thriving? Or let me put it this way. What is the moral imperative of our inaction? And what is the moral obligation of our action? Thank you.
Ruchira, both you and I have raised questions, but it's now time for you to answer questions. So let's look at what you've said. And looking to the future, you've mentioned of the processes, etc. So could you tell us, let's leave peace and security out. We can come to that a little later. But could you tell what are the three outcomes from the summit of the future that you think will be helpful in moving the process of multilateral action forward? So we'll leave Security Council reform because you've also mentioned that's a challenge there. But what are the three areas? Is it going to have a artificial intelligence institution Is it going to come up with a peace building setup? So what exactly would three areas, I mean, for the UN and multilateralism covers a host of areas. Could you look at three that we could say, all right, okay, we tick off these three?
No, Akbar, thank you for the question. I would say there are more than 3 areas, but I'll highlight 3 areas where I think the UN Summit of the Future and multilateralism can deliver. First and foremost, there is this grand project to create a global digital compact. We all live in a tech-driven era, and it is to the credit of the United Nations, I think, that very early they jumped onto this bandwagon, and the Secretary General also had a high-level advisory board to look into this issue of artificial intelligence. So I think they're right on top of it, and artificial intelligence is a very integral part, rather is going to be a very integral part of the Global Digital Compact. Now, where are we on this? I think we can hammer out some kind of a consensus, because most of the countries are agreed, and these countries are in the majority, which includes us also, that we need to bridge digital divides, we need to make AI safe, we need to make digital technologies work for social justice and empowerment. And I think that is very much the mood of the United Nations. Of course, there are discrepancies. There is, of course, the pull from the Western Bloc, certain countries, some permanent member countries. But overall, I think this is going to be a very useful outcome from the Summit of the Future. As far as a body or an institution is concerned, you've hit the nail on the head. There are talks in the United Nations about creating some kind of an agency that is located in the United Nations that would work towards global standards, that might regulate this whole new monster. And there has been some talk about creating something similar to the IAEA. So I think that is something that could eventually come out of the UN Summit of the Future. The other area where some member countries are very invested in is this whole issue of youth and future generations. It may not sound very important to us. It should actually, because we too are a very young country and we have a lot of youth power, which is very, very promising. I think a lot of countries are interested in coming out on a declaration for future generations, very conscious that we have to leave this world in better shape so that the youth can take off and inherit something from which they can then take the agenda forward. So 2 areas, certainly I think, where the Summit of the Future holds a lot of promise. So as I said, you know, if we keep peace and security aside, there is a lot of stuff that is happening in the General Assembly which can actually be very, very useful.
Thank you. And it's heartening to know that at least on these 2 areas there's movement. So let's look at some other areas, and let's look at beyond the UN in New York. So let's look at the WHO, for example. Is it, I mean, you've highlighted the failure in the last crisis. Could you tell us what's happening to tackle the next level of these? Are there any changes underway that will help in the next time these things occur? Changes, is there a global pandemic treaty being thought of? Are there changes to World Health regulations? Is there some thinking going on in those areas which are technical in nature, which can perhaps be nudged faster than the difficult complexes? Many people who worked both in New York and Geneva say it's easier to get things done in Geneva because they're all technical people there. New York, everything is politicized. So could we look at other areas beyond New York? So is there some hope there?
I would say yes. Sorry for sounding so optimistic, but yes. Because this very issue was discussed in detail last year during high-level week also, and in the run-up to high-level week, this whole issue of pandemic preparedness. I think the UN is very conscious that COVID has come and gone, but there could be many COVIDs in the offing. So I think there's been a very healthy discussion in the General Assembly about pandemic preparedness, and there's even been an agreement, and there has even been agreement on how countries should cooperate. Of course, this is very loose. It is not binding, but certainly there's thinking, and I think most countries are very conscious that the United Nations has to work together. So there has been talk, there has been thinking, and there has even been a document that has been adopted. So the UN is thinking along those lines. I would say that all the trends are very much, as you know, Akbar, yourself, are very much discussed in the United Nations. It's another matter, the latest trends are very much discussed. Member states do engage. It's another matter whether we reach an agreement all the time. But yes, I think pandemic preparedness, the next one that strikes us is definitely something that has been discussed and is being discussed.
Thank you. So maybe that's the third hopeful step. You mentioned an interesting aspect, and maybe I'll probe you there. I had it in my list, I evaded that, but you've touched on it, is that we blame the big countries for not allowing movement. We looked at one country wanting a greater say, other countries moving money from SS contributions to other places. But you also mentioned something. You said Africa wants solutions for African problems by Africans. Well then, if that's the approach of 54 members of the UN, that I want my solutions, I will address them and I will do it, what happens to this bigger goal of inclusivity? Why blame only the big guys? There are others also who perhaps share part of the blame by saying, I want my troops there, I don't want troops from others. You just give me the money, I will solve the problem. If we go down that path, then this whole notion of a globalist, inclusivist organization is being challenged by those from the South who are wanting to engage in a global architecture and work through. So maybe if you could throw a little bit of light on, and it's not only Africa. For example, ASEAN would want to solve problems of ASEAN within themselves. They don't want the Security Council to discuss this issue. So there are others also in this game where if you have to apportion blame, perhaps there is more than only the 3 or 4 big guys to be blamed. So could you share your thoughts a little bit on those issues, please? That is there blame to go around beyond the big? We know the big ones. We know what their challenges are. But what about the others?
No, you're absolutely right. There is a thinking, there is a push for Africa to solve its own problems on its own. And there have been various measures that have been taken of late, particularly the recent Security Council resolution, which very clearly provides that in case of a crisis, the Africans would rise to the occasion with their own troops, with 75% of the funding coming from the United Nations budget. But the question here is, I discussed this issue in detail with members of the Secretariat. The question really is, will this work? Will this work? And even the United Nations is quite clear that it would not necessarily be the norm. It might be the exception in a couple of cases to encourage them, but is it really going to work? Do they have the numbers? Do they have the capacity? Even the 25% financial capacity, do they have that? So I don't think that any of these measures towards regionalism really will be a substitute for the universality of the United Nations. This might be the case in some instances, it might work in some instances, and I think it is going to be tested out as a pilot, to give just one instance, but I do not believe that it would really replace what is the norm, actually, in the United Nations.
So that brings me to the last question before I open it up for others, is that if regionalism is not the solution to addressing smaller issues of a complex nature from the region, then what hope is there for minilateralism, because it's not even regional in nature, or plurilateralism, which is cross-regional? Do you see, or maybe in your experience, could you tell us some things where BRICS has done something and brought it to the UN and worked on a larger scale, or SCO has done something and brought it to the UN and looked at it as a global solution, or we just thinking that these organizations can do, but perhaps they will not do? And we could look at other organizations. I just named 2, but we could do it the same thing.
So let me name the third organization, because I dealt with it on a daily basis. It was a real headache. It's the G20. So last year we had a very successful presidency of the G20, and it was my duty to ensure that each and every line, each and every agreement that we had in the G20, I had to somehow insert it into the SDG summit of September 2023. Can you take a guess as to what happened? Nothing happened. There was such a fierce resistance. It was incredible. And by the G77 itself, which is basically the countries of the global south. And what was the argument that they gave? It was incredible and astonishing. The argument was, well, that's only 20 countries. So we said, but look, it's the Secretary General who wrote to the political leadership of our country. And the Secretary General requested the political leadership of this country to intervene and to do something to expedite implementation of the SDGs, and that's precisely what we have done. And you don't want to include that? But they said no. There was so much of a resistance. So I think there is a bit of a problem there. What the United Nations feels is that we, the 193 countries, we, this mecca of multilateralism, we will negotiate, we will discuss, we will engage, and we will not borrow language, whether it's the G20 or the G7. And I'm afraid this argument is going to be used every time in the future, because I told my team, you better use this argument, because I was given this argument when I tried to bring in G20 language. So I think that will have very limited success, Akbar.
So I will open up the discussion now for others, because from what you say, it appears that other formats are not going to yield the results that we think they are likely to yield, because there is a challenge that we seem to think that we represent a lot of them, but from what you say, they say nothing about us without us. And that's a fair argument to make, I think. So on that note, I will open up the floor for any questions. Yes, ma'am. Ambassador Veena Sikri.
Thank you, Ruchira, for a wonderful presentation. And thank you, Akbar, for that terrific introduction, which has set all of us thinking. So my question is very simple. I am surprised that there is no mention of the word terrorism in either of the presentations, and that this issue seems to have completely fallen off the radar of the United Nations. So in the Summit of the Future, do you think there's any hope under governance or any other issue under global governance that we will be able to move forward on our very precious initiative on the Global Convention against Terrorism? We've been talking about it. I know we are stuck on the definition of terrorism, I know that. But in the Summit of the Future, surely it will have some place. Is there any hope for this?
Yes, indeed, ma'am. You're absolutely right, and I'm very glad you raised that point. Actually, terrorism was one of the bread and butter issues for us in our 8th term in the Security Council, and I will just amplify a little bit on that. We were the chair of the UN's very important Counter-Terrorism Committee, and for the very first time, after 7 years, and for the first time in the history of the United Nations, the entire Security Council came down to New Delhi, and we had a very successful chairship and even had an outcome document, which is really quite a feat in these very divisive times, called the New Delhi Declaration. And then we took the matter further onward. When we did our presidency in December 22, we also had a presidential statement, again quite a feat, simply because 15 members were not on the same page. So there is a lot that we did, and there were some very strong statements that we made in the course of our presidency and even afterwards, and we don't miss a single debate, a single discussion without pointing out two very key factors. One, that terrorism is pure evil, and that we have to fight it unitedly. There should be no politics, there should be no holes, there should be no disguised vetoes, which is very often the case in the workings of the Security Council committees. There are disguised holes or disguised vetoes rather, I would say, which are placed by some permanent members of the Security Council. And then as to the Summit of the Future, looking ahead, Chapter 2, which deals with peace and security, that was indeed the strongest issue on which we have been fighting, and I think I'm very optimistic this will find mention in the UN Summit of the Future, Chapter 2 under Peace and Security, at least the principle of it. I'm afraid not the CCIT. I think there we are completely stymied. Akbar knows that very well also. But certainly a mention that terrorism needs to be fought in all its forms and manifestations unitedly. Definitely.
Just to add to that, Ambassador Suri is here. In 1996, he initiated the first letter that we wrote on CCIT. It's now almost 30 years. But I think what Ruchira was alluding to is that the same challenge that if you bring G20 language into the General Assembly, that you were finding, is the same problem you are finding today if you bring in Security Council language for a convention. So what we've worked out is best to not push it through a convention, because of course the convention has a legal imprimatur which is inclusive. But if you can use the Security Council and get it done through the Security Council, you don't need a convention which fills in the gaps. So several years ago, what we've done is we've swerved and said, let's use those bodies, because the council can also have international law. It's not only through a General Assembly resolution that you get conventions, you can have precedents in the council. So that's the pathway, and that's why what Ruchira said in terms of the visit of the committee, the language that is, but that means that we've changed track, but it's fine. You can find your goal through other means. Ambassador Karju.
I have two brief observations. I think there's been no lack of effort on our part on pushing terrorism. But I must confess, I'm not optimistic that the world will unite on terrorism. Everyone approaches it in a very segmented manner, and that, I'm afraid, will continue. That is the first. The second is, Ruchira, I think your optimism, which came through on multilateralism and the UN, was very infectious, but I doubt whether I'll catch that infection. But I had a factual question. What is the extent of India's voluntary contributions? And what is the direction of our voluntary contributions? Thank you.
So, sir, thank you for the question. I think as far as the voluntary contributions go, there's been a little bit of a, I won't say an overhaul, but a change in our thinking, in that I think earlier we were contributing voluntarily without perhaps linking this to something. That is the change. That is the change. And I think that's a very important change, because we should be as, if I may use the word, transactional as any other country.
Yes.
Madam, topic of your talk was the future of multilateralism in the days of rising nationalism. So whether the rising nationalism has harmed the multilateralism or it has helped it?
No, I think that's a fair question. That's a very fair question. And I sort of think I answered that. Well, you know, I honestly don't think it's a binary. I don't think it's a binary. I think the two can coexist. And I certainly feel that as far as peace and security is concerned, multilateralism has completely failed, without a doubt. I have no doubts in saying that loud and clear, and I think everybody's saying that. It cannot be otherwise. But I would say that, is it time to write the obituary of multilateralism? I would say no. Until something better is invented and created. And while there are numerous organizations around this globe that are doing very valuable work, but as I mentioned, the universality, this is what makes the United Nations unique. The universality, the comprehensive mandate, and of course the legitimacy of the United Nations. So I think there have been many instances, many countries have, I think, very clearly pursued the common good, and at the same time have also pursued the national self-interest.
Yes, sir. There. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentations. As I see it, the problem of multilateralism tackled is at the intergovernmental multilateralism. And it's not surprising, the UN is an intergovernmental body. So I want to ask you all, can we look at multilateralism outside governments, This is the age of popular diplomacy, popular awareness, and there is so much interest in foreign affairs all over the world and including in our country. So it's generally in a bilateral context or more things, but here. Because this pessimism or optimism question, see, look at it even as recently in the post-Cold War era. There was a time when the General Assembly could agree on an ambitious goal like general and complete disarmament. It was the period of Détente, 78. But can you imagine that kind of goal? Nuclear disarmament, it was agreed. It's an agreed goal. So we have to think of what kind of changes in the geopolitical situation would be necessary before multilateralism can be effective, again today, in today's context, in today's challenges, is one question. What can be done working towards is something. These are very huge questions, so outside anybody's things, but public opinion is very important, and today it's a very important factor. What is going on, we all know in our domestic politics, there is such a churning on the aspirational peg. So much is happening in the minds of people that things are changing. So why should we rule it out here? Okay. So that's my question about not within your system, possibility of popular or people's multilateralism.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm not too sure that I understood what you meant. Can you just simplify that? People's multilateralism. What exactly did you mean by that?
Ruchira, what he actually means is, can you also look at beyond states? That's his thinking. There are suggestions for parliamentary. There is an inter-parliamentary union. Or can you have a thing of parliamentarians, or like you were saying, youth? You go beyond nation states. The challenge is that is it a feasible option in our present times? Of course, it's a forward-looking thing. Is it possible? That's his.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. It's feasible. And I think one of the principles on which the UN functions is inclusivity and diversity. Music to my ears as far as inclusivity and diversity is concerned, because it applies in all other contexts also of the United Nations, which is also expansion of the Security Council. So yes, certainly I think so. I think that would be very useful. The UN supports that. And if there are more meetings at other levels other than governments, certainly that would be welcome. But I think still the bread and butter issues of the United Nations would still be the bread and butter issues of the United Nations, which have to be decided between nation states. For instance, the Summit of the Future, it is a very inclusive process, or it is proposed to be a very inclusive process. So it's not just member states that are discussing the outcome documents. You are consulting a whole range of actors, which also includes NGOs, etc., academics, think tanks, students. So to that extent, if that is your question, yes, that's already happening, and that is very feasible. The UN, in fact, encourages that.
So basically what Ruchira is saying, there is a multi-stakeholder process, but decision-making is finally still of the states. So the inputs can come, their suggestions can come, and they are taken into the process, but the final decision-making right now remains with the state, given that the UN is an intergovernmental body.
And yes, in fact, I would just like to add to that very quickly, member states are very possessive of this right. We ourselves, as India, have said, it's okay, bring in all the stakeholders to the process, but ultimately, the prerogative rests with the member states.
I see there is a plethora of interest, but maybe I take it on this side. Yes.
Namaste. Thank you both for very dignified leadership representing our country's interests. One question each.
One question.
Okay,
that's it.
Fine. If you had a magic wand, and if you could get anybody in the world in a room to bring out the maximum change to the UN, who would that person or group be, and what would your action be if you had a full license?
Okay.
No, I think that's a very, very hypothetical question. Very difficult to answer that. I can think of several people. I don't think there would be one party, but yeah, I think multilateralism is a process. It should be a very inclusive process, and I think it's a very good question that you've posed. Sets me thinking.
Yeah. Also, you bilateralizing everything. So this is a multilateral effort. Yes, Ambassador Raghavan.
Well, brief question. The crisis of multilateralism is much deeper and goes beyond the UN. Both of you have served in the UN and talked about it. and the structural problems you have brought out very clearly. But if you see in our own region, there is a failure of SARC. You can see very evidently the failure of ASEAN with regard to Myanmar. And most of all, there's been a larger international failure with regard to Afghanistan. So there is a crisis of multilateralism which extends far beyond the UN. And I think there this idea of resurgent nationalism certainly plays a larger than life role. What would be your comment?
Yeah, I would say to that wherever there are many actors, it's bound to be like this. It really is bound to be like this. I think no guesses about that. If you have 193 players in any room, or in the case of SARC, 7 or 8, or ASEAN, whatever the number is, 10 or 12, then it is bound to be so, because even two people cannot agree. So how can 10 or 12 or 193? I think that is in the very nature of multilateralism, and this is why, so forgive the optimism, I think this is why it makes it so great. That, you know, you can actually sit in a room till whatever, 4 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock, and then go back at 7 o'clock after just 2 hours to go on and on and on and discussing till you reach common ground. And very often it is the lowest common denominator, but then whoever said it is a perfect world. And multilateralism, no matter in what form it is not perfect. I think you have to think of the common good, the common humanity part of it.
Ambassador Raghavan, just to say, there are plenty of issues where bilateralism has failed. I mean, are we then saying that in rising nationalism, bilateralism is not now a tool that we don't accept? We still pursue with it. The areas you've dealt with, it's 75 years plus, we're still struggling even to have high commissioners there. So, I mean, let's be fair that these are tough issues, and we need to be understanding that one tool doesn't work, but so is the other tool not working. So, tools will always be, there will be shortcomings in that. Yes, Suhasini.
Ms. Kamboj, thank you very much, both of you, for your comments. This is Suhasini Haider from The Hindu. I wanted to ask very specifically, if you were to look at a 10-year space or a 20-year space, is there any specific progress on the whole question of UN Security Council reform? Because you said, no point, is it a wasted effort? But, you know, India has to be in the room. India has to raise the issue of the inequality of the UNSC. But we don't even see a text-based negotiation yet. We saw some movement in terms of a meeting last June, I think, where they spoke about a text-based negotiation. But in the absence of that, would you say there has been any kind of concrete progress on the subject of UN Security Council reform, and in particular expansion?
So the short and easy answer to that question is no, if I'm completely honest. No, there has been no movement, Suhasini. But if you really want to pick at crumbs, then yes, I think the one very minute progress is that the entire discussions on UN Security Council reform in the intergovernmental negotiations are now broadcast live. It wasn't the case until last year. And there's also a digital repository where you can put your proposals. So India's proposals are very much there to expand and reform the council. But in terms of real terms, let's be very honest, no. The answer is no.
Yeah, I'll just give last two questions, and then when Suhasini, just to answer that, frankly, we are an aspirational country. Aspirational countries should have big goals. Whether we are able to reach them in a 5-year frame or a 10-year frame is not, I think, fair to put it in a framework. We feel that there is opportunity, and we would want that, irrespective of whether it happens now, 20 years ago, or 20 years later. We will still pursue that as a goal. So we need to keep that in mind. So one last question, this lady there. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Wonderful to see both of you, Ruchira and Akbar. You know, you mentioned, Ruchira, that you wanted the UN should leave the world a better place to live in. Can you talk about climate change and what the UN is doing, you know, to secure the future of our children?
Well, on climate change, as you know, there's an entire process, and that process is yet ongoing. So I think if I were to say overall, I would say that climate change is another area where really the UN has not been very successful. But ultimately, as I said, my point, I feel, still stands that the UN is as good as the cooperation that it gets from its member states. So ultimately, you might have a Paris Accord, but it is left to the individual countries to reach to their respective NDCs. If that doesn't happen, then multilateralism again doesn't work. So that reminds me of something very interesting. India is one of the few countries, and we raised it repeatedly in the Security Council. There is an attempt currently to politicize this entire issue and to bring the climate change agenda into the agenda of the Security Council. Imagine, as though its issues were not enough. And we have opposed that. We are one of the few countries who have opposed that. And coincidentally, we have got the support from a very unlikely quarter on that, one of the permanent members of the Security Council. We did not expect that, because we feel that the right place to discuss climate change is not the United Nations Security Council, where there are just 15 members, but the Conference of Parties, where all 193 countries are represented. So I would say we are plundering along. The United Nations is plundering along on climate change.
Ambassador Smita Purushottam, just one thing. I think one of the unsaid successes of the UN have been in international law. Frankly, if you look at, say, 1980s or 1990s, the ICJ was called a court without a case. There were no cases going to the ICJ. Today, it has 25 cases, which will take them 5 or 7 years even to complete those cases. And yes, there will be certain places where some of those big states don't implement them. But there are many small states which are implementing them, including reparations, including payments, etc. And there are lots of cases coming up in the ITLOS, in the ICJ on climate. So look out for that also. So one last person here. No, this is for Ruchira. One last question here, and then we will end. Because we thought only 4 or 5, we've already answered 10 plus. Last question, yes sir.
Yeah, we started out with Donald Trump. But if you want to compare Narendra Modi, he also is equally nationalistic, and of course we don't have that kind of influence in multilateral circles, while Trump wants to withdraw from them. You think, since we are so concerned about what is happening in Gaza and in the other place, Ukraine, you think we could, India, a growing powerful country, could have gone beyond a nuanced approach and done something bilaterally with these countries? Thank you.
On what? On Ukraine and Gaza? Yes. Well, I would just say, I would simply say here that our stand on Ukraine and Gaza, and I was there, has been greatly appreciated by the international community. We've had a very clear and consistent stand on both crises, and it has been well appreciated. And in fact, I would venture so far as to state that many countries who were earlier not very sure of where we stood have actually followed our stand.
There are many young people who are raising their hands, but I will have to confess that I'll give one question to the lady there, and that's it. That's the last.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. I'm Anushka Thaplyal from Polythink Tank Me Off. So my question is, proponents of feminist foreign policy suggest that these policies can democratize and transform multilateralism and incorporate feminist approaches and principles into multilateral institutions, which can promote equality. So my question is how FFP can help in changing the power dynamics with respect to global multilateral system.
Feminist policies, can they change? How will they change multilateral approaches? Is there a role for feminist foreign policies?
Well, what I can say that the UN is, of course, a very great proponent of gender equality. And one of the SDG goals speaks to that. And in fact, one of the, if I may use the word achievements of the Secretary General, is that he has been a very strong proponent of gender equality. So I think the UN cannot be held accountable for not following this principle in letter and spirit.
So thank you, Ruchira, for this wonderful engagement. And thank you all very much for being so active and asking a plethora of questions. There were another 10. I'm sorry, I can't acknowledge that. So Thank you, Ambassador Saran, for the opportunity that you've given me to come from Hyderabad, and thank you, Ruchira, for that wonderful, eloquent articulation of multilateralism.
I must also take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Shyam Saran. Thank you so much, sir. Immense gratitude to you. And of course, to have a peer such as Akbar to chair the session, that was the icing on the cake. Thank you so much, Akbar. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you.